the forest shadows that haunted the Vikings. In the depths of winter, when the northern winds carry whispers of ancient terror, when the very trees seem to lean in with malevolent intent, there existed a people so feared that even the most bloodthirsty Viking warriors would speak their name only in hushed tones around dying fires. These were not the tales of dragons or sea monsters that sailors invented to explain their cowardice, but something far more chilling, something that walked on two legs and breathed the same air, yet struck fear into hearts that had never known true terror. The Vikings, those legendary raiders who had made coastal Europe tremble for centuries, who had sailed their dragon ships across impossible distances to burn monasteries and plunder kingdoms, who had carved their names into history with blood and steel, had met their match in the frozen wastelands of the far north. There, in the borderlands where Finland's endless forests merge with Russia's desolate Kola Peninsula, lived a people so mysterious, so utterly terrifying, that the sight of their territory markers was enough to turn back entire Viking expeditions. The Vikings called them the Bohemians, though few dared speak the name aloud, unlike the countless tribes that had fallen before the Norse war machine, unlike the villages that had surrendered at the first sight of striped sails on the horizon. The Bohemians did not merely resist, they dominated. They controlled the vital trade routes along the White Sea with an iron grip that even the most ambitious Viking chieftains could not break. Their territories remained inviolate throughout the entire Viking Age, a period when Norse expansion seemed unstoppable everywhere else. But what made these people so terrifying that warriors who laughed at death itself would turn pale at the mention of their name? What dark secrets did they possess that could make the fearless Vikings fear for their very souls? The answer lay not in supernatural powers or mystical arts, but in something far more unsettling. The Bohemians had mastered the art of becoming one with the nightmare landscape they called home, in a realm where temperatures plummeted to depths that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs, where the forests stretched endlessly like a maze designed by demons themselves, where the very ground could betray you with hidden ice that would crack beneath your feet and drag you down into black water. The Bohemians moved like phantoms. Contemporary accounts describe encounters that read like horror stories. Byzantine historians, men who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, wrote with trembling hands about the forest people who could strike without warning and vanish without trace. The Vikings themselves, a people who celebrated death in battle as the ultimate honor, carved runic warnings into their weapons about the Watchers in the White Forest, a rare acknowledgement of fear from warriors who typically knew no such emotion. The archaeological evidence paints an even more disturbing picture. Excavations in Viking burial sites within 100 kilometers of Bohemian territory reveal something that should have been impossible. Norse warriors buried with defensive weapons and protective amulets in numbers far exceeding those found anywhere else. These were not the graves of raiders confident in their superiority, but of men who had seen something in those forests that had fundamentally changed their understanding of warfare itself. The most chilling discovery came from a chieftain's burial near modern-day Arkhangelsk, where archaeologists uncovered a sword with a runic inscription that still sends shivers down the spines of those who read it. Beware the Watchers in the White Forest. This was not the boastful inscription of a conqueror, but the desperate warning of a man who had gazed into an abyss and somehow lived to tell about it. The Norse sagas, those epic tales that typically portrayed Vikings as invincible heroes, tell a different story when they speak of the Bamians. The Egil Saga, composed in the 13th century, but recounting events from the 10th, describes a raid led by the legendary warrior Thorolf Kelson that began as a typical Viking expedition, but transformed into a nightmare that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They came upon the Bamians in the night, when these people melted like shadows between the trees. The saga recounts with unusual restraint. Thor's men found themselves surrounded though they saw no army. Arrows came from all directions, striking with uncanny accuracy even in the darkness. Of 30 men who ventured inland, only 7 returned to their ships, and those 7 were never quite the same again. The Orvar Odur saga contains an even more disturbing account, one that reveals the psychological impact these encounters had on supposedly fearless warriors. They attacked like no men we had faced before, appearing suddenly from the snow itself, striking and vanishing again. Our shield wall became useless when they would not stand before us. This was not the typical saga narrative of glorious battle, but a confession of helplessness that cut to the very core of Viking identity. Perhaps most telling is the advice recorded in the Ynglinga saga, where a Norse chieftain counsels his son with words that reveal the depth of Viking terror. Seek glory in the western lands, Britain, Ireland, for the eastern forests belong to those who know secrets we do not. Men who go there seeking plunder often return without honor, if they return at all. These admissions of vulnerability stand out like bloodstains on snow against the typical saga narratives, for Viking literature rarely acknowledged defeat or fear. The very fact that these stories survived the saga writer's tendency toward glorification suggests that the encounters with the Bamians were so traumatic, so fundamentally disturbing, that they could not be edited out of the historical record. But the Vikings' fear was not based on superstition or folklore. It was grounded in the harsh reality of facing an enemy who had turned the very landscape into a weapon against them. The Bamians had not merely adapted to their environment, they had become one with it in ways that defied comprehension. Archaeological excavations reveal a level of environmental integration that borders on the supernatural. Their weapons alone tell a story of calculated terror. Bamian arrows featured innovative fletching that eliminated the whistle of flight, allowing archers to remain undetected even after multiple shots. The silence of death, arriving without warning, became their signature, a psychological weapon as effective as any blade. Analysis of these arrowheads reveals they were specifically designed to penetrate the layered leather and limited chainmail that Viking raiders typically wore, each point crafted with deadly precision for the specific purpose of killing Norse warriors. The Bamians had also mastered winter warfare in ways that gave them an almost supernatural advantage over their enemies. Artifacts discovered at settlement sites include early versions of skis that were narrower and more maneuverable than anything the Vikings possessed, allowing rapid deployment through snow so deep it would trap a Norse warrior and leave him helpless. Some burial sites contain specialized footwear with retractable bone spikes, primitive crampons that enabled movement across terrain that would leave Vikings struggling to maintain their footing while arrows found their marks. Their hunting techniques, adapted for human prey, created a landscape of terror that extended far beyond any battlefield. Historical accounts describe elaborate traps set along forest paths, forcing Vikings to choose between trudging through snow that could hide pitfalls or following trails that might conceal deadfalls designed to crush the unwary. The 12th century historian Saxo Grammaticus described a particularly effective Bamian tactic that reveals the calculating nature of their warfare. They would allow a small Viking party to penetrate their territory unchallenged. Then, cut off their retreat by felling trees across their path before attacking from all sides. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Bamian warfare was their ability to conduct night raids with the stealth that bordered on the impossible. Multiple Norse sources describe warriors who could approach sleeping encampments without alerting sentries, sometimes killing several men before anyone realized they were under attack. This ability to strike without warning created a psychological terror that went beyond mere fear of death. It was the horror of knowing that sleep itself could become a death trap. The psychological impact of these encounters fundamentally altered the Vikings' sense of themselves as warriors. For a people whose entire identity rested on being the unpredictable aggressors, the unstoppable force that struck terror into their enemies' hearts, finding themselves cast as the vulnerable targets created a crisis of understanding that extended far beyond military defeat. The Bamians did not merely defeat Viking raiding parties. They systematically dismantled the very foundations of Norse military confidence. Their methods were so alien, so utterly outside the Viking understanding of warfare, that encounters with them created a kind of psychological trauma that could not be easily dismissed or rationalized away. Beyond their military prowess, the Bamians possessed cultural practices that fundamentally unsettled Viking sensibilities in ways that proved more psychologically damaging than any physical defeat. Archaeological evidence from Bamian burial sites reveals mortuary customs that would have appeared deeply taboo to Norse observers, creating a barrier of incomprehension that made these people seem less than human to their Viking enemies. Unlike Viking burials, which typically included weapons and personal possessions that reflected the warrior's achievements in life, Bamian graves contained ritualistic items arranged in geometric patterns that archaeologists believe held astronomical significance. These burial practices suggested a relationship with death itself that was completely alien to Viking understanding, creating an aura of supernatural dread around the entire people. Viking observers were particularly disturbed by Bamian preservation practices. While Vikings typically honored their dead through ship burials or cremation, accounts suggest that the Bamians preserved their chieftains' remains through methods resembling mummification. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan recorded descriptions of northern tribes keeping the remains of their ancestors intact, a practice that would have seemed like necromancy to Viking sensibilities. The Bamian social structure also challenged Norse understanding in ways that created additional psychological barriers. Evidence suggests they maintained a non-patriarchal society where women held significant military and leadership roles. The Varangian chronicler Nicephorus noted with obvious unease, "Among these people both men and women defend their territory with equal ferocity, and a woman's arrow finds its mark as surely as a man's." For Viking raiders accustomed to facing male warriors and viewing women primarily as non-combatants, encountering female fighters would have disrupted their tactical expectations and cultural assumptions in ways that went beyond mere military surprise. It challenged the very foundations of their understanding of natural order, creating a sense of entering a realm where the basic rules of existence no longer applied. The Bamians maintained strict territorial boundaries, marked by distinctive carved posts that served as warnings to outsiders. But these were not mere property markers. Archaeological finds reveal these boundary stones featured depictions of predatory animals and abstract symbols in a style completely distinct from Norse artistic traditions. Viking accounts describe these markers in terms that suggest they considered crossing these thresholds as tempting both physical danger and supernatural consequences. The inscriptions on these boundary stones, when they could be deciphered at all, seemed to contain warnings in languages that defied translation. Some appeared to be pictographic representations of fates that would befall intruders, while others seemed to be abstract symbols that created an inexplicable sense of dread in those who looked upon them too long. The most formidable advantage the Bamians possessed was their profound adaptation to one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. An adaptation so complete that they seemed to have transcended the normal limits of human endurance. While Vikings were certainly hardy seafarers accustomed to harsh North Atlantic conditions, the deep taiga and tundra landscapes of the White Sea region presented challenges that went beyond mere physical hardship into the realm of existential terror. Modern climate data shows this region experiences temperature extremes ranging from minus 45 degrees Celsius in winter to 30 degrees Celsius in summer, fluctuations that require not just specialized knowledge, but an almost supernatural understanding of natural forces to navigate safely. The Bamians had developed this understanding over countless generations, creating a body of environmental knowledge that seemed like magic to outsiders. Archaeological evidence reveals technological innovations that demonstrate the Bamians' mastery over their environment in ways that exceeded anything the Vikings could imagine. Excavations at settlement sites have uncovered sophisticated semi-subterranean dwellings that maintained remarkably stable internal temperatures through principles of insulation and thermal mass that surpassed the efficiency of contemporary Viking houses by a margin that seems impossible without modern technology. One particularly well-preserved dwelling, discovered near modern-day Severodvinsk, maintained an estimated internal temperature of 15 degrees Celsius, even when external temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, all without continuous firing of hearths. The engineering principles behind this achievement remain partially mysterious even to modern archaeologists, suggesting a level of environmental understanding that bordered on the supernatural. The Bamian winter mobility technologies gave them advantages that must have seemed like sorcery to their Viking enemies. While Vikings essentially ceased major land operations during deep winter, the Bamians maintained activity year-round with an efficiency that defied natural law. Specialized ski designs found in Bamian territories feature distinctive asymmetrical patterns. One ski shorter and wider for pushing, one longer and narrower for gliding. That experimental archaeology has shown can achieve speeds up to 15 kilometers per hour across snow. To a Viking struggling through the same terrain in heavy armor, watching a Bamian warrior glide silently across the snow at impossible speed must have been like witnessing a supernatural phenomenon. The psychological impact of facing enemies who moved through the winter landscape, as if the laws of physics themselves bent to their will, cannot be overstated. Contemporary accounts describe how Bamians used natural features as defensive infrastructure, with a sophistication that suggested an almost mystical understanding of their environment. The Arab geographer al-Idrisi, compiling information from northern traders, noted with obvious discomfort that these forest people know when the ice will bear weight and when it will break. They lead pursuers onto lakes where the ice appears solid but will shatter beneath armed men. Modern glaciologists confirm that the region's freeze-thaw cycles create precisely these conditions, where ice thickness can vary dramatically within short distances. But the Bamians' ability to predict these variations with perfect accuracy, to know exactly where the ice would hold and where it would fail, seemed like supernatural knowledge to their enemies. Equally disturbing was their ability to navigate their territory with precision that defied explanation. Analysis of settlement patterns shows strategic positioning that balanced resource access with defense in ways that suggest a comprehensive understanding of landscape dynamics that took generations to develop. Viking accounts frequently mention becoming completely disoriented in Bamian forests while the locals moved effortlessly without any visible markers or navigation aids. The Norse chronicler Snorri Sturluson wrote, with reluctant admiration tinged with fear, "They move through their forests as easily in darkness as in daylight, while our bravest warriors become lost within sight of shore." This was not mere familiarity with terrain, but a level of environmental integration that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. While many encounters between Vikings and Bamians remain shrouded in legend and folklore, several historically verified confrontations demonstrate the practical reality behind Viking terror. Archaeological evidence provides tangible proof of Norse defeats that rarely appear in their own historical narratives, defeats so complete and devastating that they fundamentally altered the course of Viking expansion. The most thoroughly documented and psychologically damaging conflict occurred during Thorhunn's expedition of 1026 CE, a confrontation that became a cautionary tale whispered around Viking hearths for generations. Contemporary accounts in both Norse sagas and Russian chronicles describe how this prominent Norwegian chieftain led a substantial force estimated at 300 warriors in 3 longships into Bamian territory, seeking trade advantages and tribute from what they assumed would be another easily conquered people. The expedition began with typical Viking confidence. Initial trading sessions proceeded smoothly, and the Norse warriors began to believe they had found another group of forest primitives who would yield to superior Viking military technology. But when Thor's forces attempted to raid what they believed was a poorly defended Bamian sacred site, the response was swift, devastating, and utterly unlike anything they had ever experienced. Archaeological excavations near the White Sea coast have uncovered what appears to be the aftermath of this very conflict. A mass grave containing approximately 40 individuals, buried with Norse weapons and personal items dating to the early 11th century. But the condition of these remains tells a story of horror that goes beyond mere military defeat. Skeletal analysis reveals injuries consistent with ambush tactics of the most brutal kind. A high proportion of wounds to the rear of the skull and back, suggesting attacks from behind by enemies who struck without warning and showed no mercy. The pattern of injuries indicates that many of the Vikings were killed while attempting to flee, cut down as they ran in terror through forests that had become a maze of death. Carbon dating confirms these remains date to the precise period of Thor's expedition, and the Varangian Chronicle provides additional context that reveals the true scope of the disaster. Of Thor's 3 ships that sailed east, only 1 returned to Norway, so reduced in men that boys had to help work the oars. This represents a casualty rate approaching 70%. Catastrophic for any military expedition, but particularly devastating for Vikings whose entire culture revolved around military prowess. The psychological impact of such a defeat extended far beyond the immediate survivors. The very idea that a Viking force could be so thoroughly destroyed by enemies who seemed to materialize from thin air challenged fundamental assumptions about Norse superiority. The survivors who returned to Norway carried with them not just physical wounds but psychological scars that would influence Viking attitudes toward the eastern forests for generations. Another significant encounter, known in Norse accounts as the Battle of Sleeping Fires, demonstrates the sophisticated and terrifying nature of Bamian defensive preparations. In approximately 995 CE, an expeditionary force led by Eric Bloodaxe's son Hakon attempted a winter raid, reasoning that frozen waterways would provide easy access to Bamian settlements and that the harsh conditions would leave the defenders vulnerable. The Vikings could not have been more wrong. Excavations near the Dvina River have revealed carefully prepared defensive positions that suggest the Bamians had been anticipating such an attack for years. Concealed fire pits containing oil-soaked materials could be ignited on command, creating sudden walls of flame that would channel attacking forces into prepared ambush positions with mathematical precision. The Norse account describes the outcome with a terseness that barely conceals the horror of the experience. The forest people let them penetrate deep into the frozen river, then surrounded them with fires that sprang from the ice itself. Caught between flames and hidden archers, Hakon's force was reduced to half before they fought free. The image of Viking warriors trapped between walls of supernatural fire, while invisible enemies picked them off one by one, became a recurring nightmare in Norse oral tradition. Archaeological finds reveal that Vikings began adapting their equipment and tactics in response to these conflicts. But these adaptations speak to a level of fear that went beyond normal military caution. Excavations of 11th century Norse settlements show distinct modifications to shields and armor among warriors known to have engaged with Bamians, increased protection to the rear and flanks, additional leather reinforcement against arrow strikes, and specialized face protection beyond what was typically used in other Viking conflicts. These adaptations represent a significant investment in defensive rather than offensive capability. Highly unusual for Viking military development, which typically focused on aggressive tactics and overwhelming force. The fact that Vikings were willing to sacrifice mobility and offensive capability for protection against Bamian attacks reveals just how thoroughly these encounters had shaken their confidence. The psychological impact of these defeats created changes in Viking culture that extended far beyond military tactics. Sagas from the period reveal a new category of warrior, those who had survived encounters with the Bamians and carried with them a haunted quality that set them apart from their comrades. These men were both feared and respected, possessed of knowledge that others did not want to share. Some of these survivors became seers and advisors, consulted before any expedition that might venture into the eastern territories. Their counsel was sought not for tactical advice, but for something more fundamental: guidance on whether the spiritual and psychological risks of such ventures outweighed any potential rewards. The very existence of such figures within Viking society represents a fundamental shift in cultural understanding, despite the frequent conflicts that marked their relationship. Necessity drove Vikings and Bamians into complex trade relationships that created structured exchange networks ensuring goods flowed in both directions. But these were not the typical trade relationships that Vikings maintained with other peoples. They were conducted with an undercurrent of mutual fear and respect that created protocols unlike anything found elsewhere in the Viking world. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for these relationships is the Kemijoki hoard, discovered in 1989, a cache of 1,700 silver coins and trade goods that reveals the complexity of Viking-Bamian economic interactions. The hoard contains a blend of Byzantine, Arabic, and Norse silver. Some pieces marked with distinctive Bamian ownership symbols that suggest a sophisticated system of property identification and exchange verification. The dating of the hoard suggests that trade persisted even at the height of military hostilities, proving that economic necessities could override warfare in ways that required both sides to develop unprecedented levels of cooperation despite their mutual fear. This was not the simple extraction of tribute that characterized Viking relationships with weaker peoples, but a complex system of mutual benefit that required both sides to acknowledge each other's strengths. Viking sites along the White Sea contain clear traces of Bamian influence that go far beyond simple trade goods. High-quality furs, Baltic amber, and walrus ivory, crafted with distinctive Bamian techniques, appear in Norse settlements throughout the region, worked with artistic styles that began influencing Viking craftsmanship in subtle but significant ways. Even more significant are the traces of Bamian influence on Viking survival techniques. Analysis of Viking cooking vessels shows evidence of Bamian fish preservation methods that greatly extended storage life, techniques that would have been essential for Viking survival in the harsh northern climate. The adoption of these methods represents more than simple trade. It suggests a level of cultural exchange that required trust and cooperation, despite the underlying atmosphere of fear. In return, Bamians received Norse iron tools, textiles, and exotic goods from distant markets like Baghdad and Constantinople. But the organized distribution of these items throughout Bamian territories suggests structured trade networks rather than sporadic plunder. Systems that required both peoples to maintain diplomatic relationships despite their military conflicts. Historical sources confirm the existence of these complex exchanges through descriptions of designated neutral trade zones, where neither side held territorial advantage. The Grettir saga describes locations where weapons were forbidden, and both Vikings and Bamians could conduct business under agreed-upon terms of mutual safety. The Olaf Tryggvason saga mentions an even more intriguing practice: the silent bartering system, where goods were exchanged without direct negotiation or even face-to-face contact. Vikings would leave trade goods at designated locations and return later to find them replaced with equivalent value in Bamian products, a system that allowed commerce to continue even when direct contact was considered too dangerous. Archaeological findings support these historical accounts, with excavations near Kandalaksha revealing hybrid trade structures designed specifically for winter exchanges. Separate entrances and strategically placed fire pits allowed both sides to conduct business while maintaining cautious distance. Architectural features that speak to the careful balance of cooperation and fear that characterized these relationships. The most remarkable aspect of these trade relationships is how they evolved into something approaching diplomatic protocol. Both sides developed systems for signaling peaceful intent, methods for resolving disputes without violence, and procedures for maintaining trade even during periods of active hostility. These diplomatic innovations represent some of the most sophisticated international relations of the medieval period. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Viking encounters with the Bamians was the way these relationships shaped the broader pattern of Norse expansion. The existence of a force capable of stopping Viking expansion created a stable eastern boundary that influenced the development of northern Europe for centuries. Bamian resistance effectively channeled Viking expansion into alternative directions, contributing to their deeper penetration into Russian river networks and their eventual role in the formation of the Kievan Rus. The fact that Vikings were forced to seek roots around Bamian territories rather than through them fundamentally altered the patterns of trade and cultural exchange that shaped medieval Europe. Unlike many groups that were eventually absorbed into Norse spheres of influence, the Bamians retained their cultural identity well into the 12th century. Historical records and modern genetic studies confirm minimal Norse influence beyond the established frontier zones, demonstrating that Bamian resistance was not merely military, but cultural as well. The frontier zone that emerged between Viking and Bamian territories became a unique cultural laboratory where elements of both civilizations blended while maintaining distinct boundaries. This borderland saw innovations in technology, trade practices, and diplomatic protocols that influenced both cultures while preventing either from completely dominating the other. The legacy of Viking encounters with the Bamians extends far beyond the immediate historical period. These conflicts represented one of the few instances where Viking expansion was stopped not by superior numbers or technology, but by superior adaptation to environmental conditions and more sophisticated understanding of asymmetric warfare. The psychological impact of these encounters on Viking culture can be traced through changes in their literature, religious practices, and military organization. The admission of fear and vulnerability that appears in sagas dealing with the Bamians represents a fundamental shift in Viking self-perception that influenced their interactions with other peoples throughout the medieval period. Modern archaeological investigations continue to reveal new evidence of these encounters, each discovery adding layers to our understanding of how the meeting of these two peoples influenced the development of Northern European civilization. The story of the Bamians serves as a reminder that even the most dominant military cultures can encounter forces that challenge their assumptions about warfare, environment, and the very nature of human adaptation. In the end, the tale of the Vikings and the Bamians is not simply a story of military conflict, but a complex narrative about cultural encounter, environmental adaptation, and the limits of military power when faced with people who had achieved perfect harmony with their environment. It is a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us that the most terrifying enemies are often those who know secrets we do not, who move through landscapes that defeat us while they glide across them like ghosts, and who understand that the greatest weapon is not the sword or the arrow, but the ability to become one with the very forces that seek to destroy us. The Bamians achieved something that no other people of their time managed. They made the Vikings afraid. In doing so, they changed the course of history itself, creating boundaries that shaped the development of civilizations and proving that even the most fearsome warriors could meet their match in the frozen forests of the far north, where shadows moved with purpose and the very trees seemed to watch with malevolent intelligence. The forest people had become legend, but legends born from truth are the most terrifying of all.